As a kid, the Game Boy Color was just the coolest thing. With modern panels, devices like this are just getting even better. After the Game Boy Color, I owned a Game Boy Advance. I didn't own it for very long before migrating to the Game Boy Advance SP. Devices like the Anbernic RG34XX SP made it really easy to recommend, especially if you grew up playing the SP. It essentially saves you from modding an SP, which is a really difficult process. These came with a modern IPS screen and they're really nice. Well, Anbernic thinks they've done it again with the RG34XX. Not only do they have one for the SP, but now they also have one for the Game Boy Advance. Having moved from the original Game Boy Color to the SP, that one in the center was always missing for me. I was originally going to pass on reviewing the RG34XX. I've just reviewed a lot of Anbernic devices over the past year. This one started to catch my eye pretty quickly. After I started to see some reviews for it, I really started to get interested in trying it. So is the RG34XX a really good alternative to modding a Game Boy Advance? Let's hop in and find out. Just a disclaimer as well before we hop in, this unit here was provided to me for a review from LitNXT. As with all my reviews, they're not seeing this video beforehand, they have no input in what I say, and of course, I'm just going to give you guys my honest thoughts to what I think about it. So what exactly is the RG34XX? Let's go over to LitNXT's website and take a quick peek. Right off the bat, this is advertised as a nice little mini handheld, so this should be easy to pocket. This comes in a few different colors. You can get this in indigo blue, glacier blue, translucent red, translucent green, and of course black. I of course opted for the transparent red. The OS will come on a 32GB memory card, but it's up to you if you want that with games included. You can source your own game and save a little bit of money, bringing this down to $89.99. For $10 more, you can get a 64GB with some pre-included games. A nice thing about LitNXT is they also have these little bundle deals. So if you wanted to just get the 32GB with no games, which is what I'd recommend, if you want to bundle it with something, you can save a little bit of money that way. If you wanted the official carrying case, which usually costs $12.99 instead of $89.99, if you put it in a bundle, it'll only cost $90.62. This brings the bag to about 63 cents, which is definitely worth it. As far as the specs go, this comes with the same Linux OS that we've seen on a lot of other Anbernic handhelds. The screen is a 3.4-inch IPS panel and it is fully laminated. This also has 3 times the standard resolution of a regular Game Boy Advance at 720 by 480. This uses the same H700 processor that we've seen in a lot of handhelds before. It has 1 gig of LPDDR4 memory and that OS is stored on a 32GB microSD card. The battery is only 3300 mAh, but it still should give us about 8 hours of battery life, and I found this to be pretty accurate. It also has AC Wi-Fi, which is pretty unique for a handheld like this. If you're interested in the RG34XX, I'll leave a link below to LitNXT's website and a coupon as well. So let's get to the unboxing and take a closer look at the RG34XX. The box itself is pretty standard for Anbernic. On the side it shows that I do have that transparent red model, and there's nothing really else, so let's open it up. Taking off the lid, we're greeted with the SD card. These are just standard generic micro SD cards, so I would recommend cloning your OS to something a little bit more reliable. Let's take out the device itself. I'm just going to put this over here for now. There's nothing else underneath here except a screen protector. We also get a little lanyard. In this box, we have a standard USB-C cable. This of course is USB-A to USB-C. Let's take a closer look at the device itself. I'll leave the link below to my modding video if you're interested in checking it out after. But from what I remember, this feels pretty much on par with an OEM Game Boy Advance. The shell feels really high quality, and all in all, I'm actually kind of impressed. The shell is this nice dark transparent red. I do wish that these buttons were black, but the gray matches it pretty nice too. I ended up selling my Game Boy Advance because I was going to use the SP a little bit more, so I don't have an original to compare with it anymore. First impressions are very good. As far as an Anbernic device goes, this feels really high quality. Taking a brief look at the overview of the device, we have our D-pad over here on the left. This D-pad is rubber membrane. It's really mushy, but it has a nice pivot in the center. Our face buttons are over here on the right. The interesting thing is, well, they've managed to include 2 extra buttons. The lettering is actually underneath the plastic, and it matches the shell really good. So from a distance, this would look like an original Game Boy Advance. The face buttons are rubber membrane. They're a little loose, but I don't think they're going to rub on the shell as a result. These are not bad, actually. They're also pretty quiet when you push them down. We also have a power LED on the top right, a mono speaker in the bottom right corner, just like with the stock Game Boy Advance. On the bottom left corner, we have the start and select buttons. These are also rubber membrane, and they look very similar to the stock buttons that you would see on a real Game Boy Advance. On the top, we have the L1 and R1. We also get L2 and R2. These are, of course, also rubber membrane. You do have to push around here for the bumper to actually register. There's a button up here that says M. I believe this is the menu button. We have an HDMI port, a charging/OTA USB-C port up at the top, and TF1 is of course the firmware files, so it looks like they do include another memory card. That 128 I guess was just the games. The micro SD card over here is the one that you'd put in with your games. On the back we don't really see anything. There's a little label up here and the battery. I do wish this battery was just black. It's a little distracting with the zebra design on it. On the bottom, on the left side, we have the power button. There's a headphone jack on the right with a volume wheel. Unlike the original Game Boy Advance, which had a volume wheel, this one, you kind of have to rock back and forth to turn up and down the volume. So I would say I'm actually pretty impressed with the overall design and build quality, especially for an Anbernic device. Like the SP, this one feels like it's built really well. So how does this compare size-wise to other handhelds that I own? This is going to be very similar to the original Game Boy Advance, especially in size. The only difference from this is it's going to be slightly thicker and maybe ever so slightly heavier. As far as pocketability goes, this is about on par with the Game Boy Color, and just ever so slightly narrower. The 35XX SP is much easier to carry around. That's because this folds up and you can just stick it in your pocket quite easily. The SP is also ever so slightly thicker. Comparing this to some of Anbernic's other devices, the 40XXV is huge in comparison. The 40XXH is only ever so slightly bigger. Devices like the TrimUI brick are going to be way smaller. What does the overall size look like on this device? The D-pad measures in at 17.6 millimeters. The face buttons come in at 8.3. This device is 81.3 millimeters tall and 25 millimeters thick. As far as weight goes, this comes in at 191.2 grams. Comparing that to my modded Game Boy Color with batteries and a game in it, that's ever so slightly heavier at 226.3 grams. The Anbernic SP comes out to 195 grams right on the dot. The TrimUI brick comes out to 161.6 grams. The 40XXH comes out to 201.9 grams. The 40XXV is slightly heavier at 215 grams. So in terms of what's close to the Anbernic GBA, at 190.7 grams. If you like the weight of the Anbernic SP, I think you're going to really like the weight of the Anbernic GBA. So as far as build quality goes, I'll be honest, I haven't been really impressed with the old Anbernic units. Around the SP and the 40XXH lineup is where they started getting their quality a lot better. The build quality on this one is no different. The shell on this feels as good as the aftermarket Game Boy Advance shells. I'm not seeing any defects in the plastic either. There's no cracks and everything looks to be in good shape. I even checked on the sides and I'm not seeing any plastic imperfections. The build quality is actually kind of surprising. This is really nice. My initial concern before I got this was that maybe this back part here where the L2 and R2 sit was going to feel kind of cheap, but it feels a lot better than you think it would. Because the shell is as good as an aftermarket shell from somebody like Funny Playing or High Speed Dito, I'm just really impressed. Where I think they did a really good job here was not adding a joystick. They stuck to the original Game Boy Advance design. Had they put a joystick on this somewhere, I think it would have just ruined the whole thing. The only difference that they added was these 2 extra buttons up here, but because they blended the shell, it doesn't really bother me. I was kind of worried that these were going to stick out a little bit more and that I was going to be bothered by them, but yeah, I really like it. Taking a closer look at the D-pad, this is rubber membrane. This is actually really quiet for rubber membrane. It's not clacky and it's not hitting the edge of the shell. There's a lot of space around it, so you're not going to have that issue. There's also a really nice range of pivot to it. It's not the tallest D-pad, but it does stick out enough out of the shell to be comfortable. As far as D-pads go, this is one of the better ones that I've seen on an emulation device. I prefer retro-like, and this reminds me a lot of the one on the Game Boy Color. The face buttons also feel really retro-like. There's a little bit of wiggle in them, as I mentioned earlier. They're a little clacky because they will hit the edge of the shell, but not enough to be bothersome. These just feel like your standard rubber membrane face buttons. If you've used a modded Game Boy Color, these feel almost nearly identical. The top ones also feel the same as the bottom. They do have a slightly different texture to them though, as opposed to the ones in the bottom. The bumpers also feel really good. You can use them to about here. You can't really press them at the top because they kind of sit on a hinge. They're also really quiet. The L2 and R2 is very similar. These do require a little bit more pressure to push down as opposed to the L1 and R1. The reset button up here is a switch based, but it's not too loud either, and it's not very clicky. The menu button is also dome based. This one, however, does feel a little bit more clicky. The volume button is really quiet. It doesn't sit in the center though, it kind of sits on the lower part of it, which is kind of interesting. The power button is also switch based. It's not too loud though. Again, the start and select buttons are rubber membrane, and they're also really quiet. I like this. As far as the ergonomics go, it's not bad. It's about what you expect it to be. The Game Boy Advance was a smaller device, and with adult-sized hands, it's still kind of comfortable to play. I find my pointer fingers kind of rest in these little notches, and my hands spread across the back. It's also nice and comfortable how rounded the sides are. I think I could play this for many hours with no issues. In case you're wondering as well, this uses a brand name Kioxia memory card. You won't have to replace the microSD card that holds your firmware. This card is made by Toshiba. They make really nice microSD cards. So let's power this up and take a closer look at the device for the first time. Loading things up, the volume is pretty loud. You're going to have to press the volume rocker once for each volume notch. If you've seen my Anbernic SP review, you already know what to expect here. The RA game menu is going to show you all your different systems. I don't have that microSD card in there, so I think I should turn this off, plug that in, and let's give it another reboot. Alright, so now that we've got it booted, the game room should be able to show all your different systems. Between this and the SP, I'd love to have this device dedicated exclusively for Game Boy Advance. To exit a game, just press the menu, press back, then just hit quit. Loading a game from the game room is going to look a little different. If you press the menu in the game room, you're going to come up with a different menu here. You can change the screen effects. It looks like we can brighten it up here to about 5, so I can go only up one more level, but that does help quite a bit. And the screen looks a lot better now. Colors look okay. I'm used to OLED and AMOLED displays. I just wish it was a little bit more saturated, but it still looks pretty decent, especially for the price. The menu to the right of that is the App Center. This allows us to do things like listen to music, watch videos, read ebooks if you're feeling brave. There's an expert menu. There's another app menu here. To the right of that is the favorites menu. We have the history menu to that, a search menu, and of course the settings. You can change how long it takes for the screen to lock out. You can also change the backlight brightness here. This would be really good for playing at night. And 5 is pretty decently bright, but I do wish this was ever so slightly brighter. We also have an I/O test in here, which lets you check all your buttons. I would definitely recommend doing this with a new device just to make sure everything works. You can edit the RetroArch settings in here and configure your network settings. You can also change the background if you wanted to. You can turn off the button sound. That's definitely something I'm going to do. Clearing the record is going to delete your save files, so just be careful with that. And that's pretty much all there is to it. It's a very simple interface, but it does work. To add anything to your favorites menu, just navigate over the game that you're looking at and just press the start button. This also has a hibernate menu, so all you have to do is just press this once and it goes in a hibernate. That light is going to go off. You should be able to pick this back up in a couple hours. I wouldn't leave this in hibernate all day, but hibernate does work pretty decently. Pressing the button again, the screen's just going to come back instantly. It enters and exits hibernate mode really quick. This section is always hard for me to capture because I have to boost the audio on my microphone for this to show up. Let me try recording it and we'll see if we can get some audio samples. Compared to the Anbernic SP, this one is louder, but the Anbernic SP also sounds cleaner. Probably the most disappointing thing about this would be the speakers, I guess, so far. Speakers are decent, but they're not amazing. Now, in regards to the panel, this is an area where it's either make or break for me. I like a really bright panel, but I also like a really saturated panel. If a panel is pretty bad, I just don't find myself using the device very often. Color accuracy also has to be really good, and the temperature should be on point. How does the Anbernic GBA stack up? As mentioned, it's not the best panel in the world. I don't even think it's going to beat the TrimUI brick, but it should do nicely for most situations. With the lights off, let's compare this to a couple other handhelds. I'm going to leave the Anbernic GBA on the top, and the one we're comparing it to is going to be on the bottom. The 40XXH looks much brighter, and the screen also looks a lot more saturated. The Anbernic GBA also looks a little bluish. I'm not sure why, but it's not as accurate as the panel on the 40XXH. I didn't actually mind the panel on the 40XXH, I thought it was pretty decent. It's kind of a shame to see the panel on the Anbernic GBA fall a little short here. Comparing this to the Anbernic SP, the results are pretty similar. The Anbernic SP looks a little bit brighter. This is also with all the shaders off. Another thing that's kind of interesting is the color looks a little blue even compared to the Anbernic SP. So putting these side by side, I do think the screen on the Anbernic SP is a much better screen. Colors also look ever so slightly more vibrant on the Anbernic SP. So let's try another handheld. Even from just putting this down, you can tell that the TrimUI brick has a much better panel too. This is a much brighter panel on the TrimUI brick. The colors also look way more vibrant and saturated, and the color temperature is again a lot more accurate. I'm just really impressed with the TrimUI brick every time I turn this thing on. I guess what you're buying here is you're basically buying the form factor. The GBA was a nostalgic device for a lot of people. Stepping things up to an even better display, the Analogue Pocket is just much better. The Analogue Pocket screen is way more vibrant and much brighter. Having these two side by side really shows those differences. What about compared to an OLED or an AMOLED? You gotta keep in mind that the Retroid Pocket 5 is a much more expensive device. Everything considered, if a screen is important to you, you might be disappointed with the Anbernic GBA. The color temp, the saturation, and of course the brightness all fall a little short for my liking. You can get a much better screen with the TrimUI brick for about the same price. Now that doesn't mean that it's a bad device, and screen quality doesn't really bother everybody. I'm really picky compared to most people with panels. Not a bad screen overall, just not the best. Let's turn on the lights and talk about this device a little more. As far as other panel issues go, I can't find anything wrong with this device. I'm not seeing any dead pixels, and the uniformity on the panel looks really good. There's also quite a lot of screen display effects. We can go from scan lines to the standard IPS display, which is just fast. However, the default, which is dot matrix, also looks really nice on here. This gives you a pixel effect that you'd find on a regular Game Boy Advance screen. But for me anyways, I just like this standard IPS look, or the HD one is pretty nice too. The panel's decently bright, and it does look nice on your games. Just compared to some of the other handhelds in this hobby, the screen just falls a little short. Compared to a modded Game Boy Advance, the screen is pretty comparable. This also just saves you the trouble of modding the Game Boy Advance yourself. You're getting a pretty comparable screen. As far as the charging goes, let's see if it works with USB-C to C. So it looks like you can charge this with a USB-C to C cable. This is charging at 4.9 volts, 1.5 amps with 7 watt charging. I wanted to use this exclusively for Game Boy Advance, and it doesn't disappoint. I'm actually really impressed with this device and just how good it is. If you grew up playing the Game Boy Advance, I think you'll really like this device. I'm liking it a lot more than I thought I was gonna, even though the screen falls a little short of my expectations. The speakers are pretty decent, and it's quite pocketable. I also had some issues modding my original Game Boy Advance. I'll leave that video linked in the description. But this just makes it so much easier. If you want a Game Boy Advance and you want to save yourself the trouble of modding one, this is a great way to go about it. A lot of the mods you'd pay extra for, like your rechargeable battery, are obviously included in this. You also don't have to do the USB-C mod because that's obviously built into this one too, and you can just have all your games on a micro SD card. Makes it so much easier. Where it counts though, like with the controls, they do feel very similar to the originals. Maybe we'll see a custom OS that lets us change the saturation on the screen. What do you think about the Anbernic GBA? Is this something that you're interested in? Do you own one already? What do you think about it? I think it's cool how it plays other systems too. You're not going to get that functionality on an original Game Boy Advance, or even a modded one. So my final thoughts, can I recommend this device? I think so. Overall, it's pretty good. I'm really impressed with the controls. The battery life has been excellent so far, and it's been roughly what they've advertised. If you grew up playing the original Game Boy Advance, but you don't want to go through the process of modding one, I don't think you can go wrong with the Anbernic GBA. Or as they call it, the Anbernic RG34XX. But let me know what you think of this device in the comments below. Is it worth it for you? Do you have one? What do you think about it? If you have any questions regarding the device, make sure to let me know in the comments as well. And as always, thanks for watching everyone.